Good afternoon, and on behalf of the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. Our outstanding panel of speakers will be discussing the new report, The Blueprint for Equitable Digital Participation, which explores how connectivity policies can better reflect community perspectives and lived experience. As a qualitative researcher, I'm also especially pleased that today's conversation highlights the real value of qualitative research in bringing nuance to policy debates and helping us understand not just whether policies are achieving their intended goals, but how they're actually experienced by the people who they're meant to serve. With that, I'm pleased to introduce and hand over the reins to Dr. Caroline Stratton, Benton's Research Director, who will be moderating today's discussion. Caroline?
Thanks, Dr. Prasad. I'm Caroline Stratton, Research Director of the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society, and our discussion today is going to be centered around this new paper, The Blueprint for Equitable Digital Participation. It's a project developed by Public Knowledge, Unidos US, and the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. And it's notable because it centers the voices of low to middle income households across the nation in policy proposals for equitably closing the digital divide. I'm excited to be your moderator, and before we begin the conversation, we're first going to hear from Gina Cooper-Benjamin of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, and we'll have a brief presentation about the paper itself. So welcome, Gina.
Hi, Caroline. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. To kick off my remarks, I want to share a powerful quote from the Blueprint that strikes at the heart of why we're all here today. Begin quote. In my neighborhood, and a lot of it through Denver Housing Authority that I'm involved with, there's a big need for more training on devices, on how to even start them and use them and wake them up, and also cautionary things like how to avoid phishing scams. Basically, education and access to devices. End quote. At NDIA, that is exactly what we believe. Our mission to support community programs and equip policymakers to act is rooted in the conviction that everyone deserves access to affordable internet, reliable devices, and the critical digital skills needed to thrive in today's digital world. At our core, we believe everyone should be able to safely access the digital world in a way that is meaningful to them. I want to extend a massive thank you to Dr. Elisa Valentin, Claudia Ruiz, and the entire team for the years of work they put into the Blueprint for Equitable Digital Participation. This blueprint fills in an urgent gap in research by doing something rare. It directly centers the lived experiences and strategic wisdom of people on the ground. Reading this valuable research was incredibly refreshing because it affirms the value of what NDIA affiliates, advocates, and allies do every single day. We know that a whole government approach is what it takes to truly address the digital divide. And in the wake of the federal government stepping back with the lapse of programs like ACP and loss of Digital Equity Act programs, we are seeing amazing innovation from our city and state governments and grassroots leaders. We understand that the physical wires and affordable plans that get us online and the human infrastructure that powers communities are both vital. Digital equity is paramount to sustain a skilled workforce, healthy community, and an inclusive, prosperous economy. This key finding from the Blueprint reminds us the digital divide further compounds every other challenge communities face, intersecting with housing stability, healthcare, employment, and education. And I would add democracy itself. We have a right to the information and skills we need to make informed decisions. To community members, share this blueprint and use it to advocate for the resources you deserve. Policymakers, use this tool to remember what we mean when we say digital equity and digital opportunity for all. Funders, get to know digital inclusion programs and advocates. Invest heavily in grassroots ecosystems. Let's keep building. Thank you and congratulations to Elisa and Claudia.
Thanks, Gina. It's a testament to the strength of the public interest community in research and advocacy that we're all here today. National Digital Inclusion Alliance, Public Knowledge, Unidos US, Benton, and our research partners that are going to join in to talk about the report. It's clear that the community that we have of practitioners, of researchers, are really resilient and seeking innovation in this space right now. So next, so that we can prepare for the conversation, we're going to hear from Dr. Elisa Valentin, one of the co-authors of the blueprint itself. She's the Broadband Policy Director at Public Knowledge, and she's going to walk us through how the project came about, the methodology, and she'll highlight a few of the findings in a brief presentation. Welcome, Elisa.
Great. Thank you so much, Caroline. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Elisa Valentin. I'm the Broadband Policy Director at Public Knowledge. We are a Washington, D.C.-based consumer advocacy organization whose mission is to promote freedom of expression and open internet and access to affordable communications tools and creative works in the public interest. As part of PK's ongoing effort to center equity in our work, such as through our national and local partnerships in what we advocate for and also in how we advocate for the public interest, in 2024, we partnered with organizations Unidos US and NDIA, as well as their local affiliates, to center community wisdom in conversations about broadband policy. We know that stories move hearts, but we also know that data moves minds, so we want it both in our report. We hosted 7 focus group sessions in Colorado, Georgia, New Mexico, and Ohio between September 2024 and March 2025, with participants living in households earning $70,000 or less annually. Following the focus groups, we conducted a nationwide survey in April 2025 to capture the challenges low and middle income households face around broadband access, broadband affordability, and broadband adoption. We understand that federal policymaking in Washington continues to operate largely through networks of access and influence and well-resourced interests, networks that really reinforce existing power structures and keep stale and accurate narratives about broadband alive. And in our opinion, that misdirects resources away from the people they are meant to serve. As a result, the authentic voices of low and middle income consumers are erased, or they're challenged, or they're dismissed. And we wanted to change that, particularly given the moment that we're in. It's a moment of sweeping policy reversals, and as support is being stripped away from our most vulnerable communities, and the language of waste, fraud, and abuse is being weaponized to justify harmful cuts, all while those in power use their positions to benefit themselves and their billionaire friends. It is more clear than ever that we are living in an era that's shaped by the politics of deservingness. So we set out to build recommendations that pass the kitchen table test. And the result is the blueprint for equitable digital participation, which confronts systemic exclusion by centering the community wisdom of the people most impacted by the digital divide. We wanted to embrace common sense approaches, but we also wanted to push ourselves to imagine something bolder and something better that really helps us to have a more just digital future. So in our report, affordability emerged as a central challenge throughout focus group discussions, with participants consistently noting that cost is a significant ongoing barrier to broadband adoption. Many discussed the financial pressures their households face when they have competing needs. For example, one participant in Atlanta, Georgia explained, "I have 5 kids and my wife, and I'm the only one who works. So $40 for internet is pushing it. It's limiting on what's in the refrigerator, a utility bill, water, electricity. So it's either put food on the table for 6 people or have the internet." Across rural and urban communities, we heard concerns that America's aging, underfunded, and fragmented broadband infrastructure leaves people vulnerable to service disruptions whenever a single provider goes down. The lack of competition also creates the permission structure for less reliable, lower quality broadband. A consumer in Albuquerque compared their broadband experience to a hyena because it is, quote, poor quality that doesn't offer the plans my family needs. In Marietta, Ohio, participants explain how inadequate broadband infrastructure shapes their families' experiences and opportunities. These connectivity gaps also affect regional economic development because reliable broadband plays a key role in business investment decisions, compounding disadvantages for underserved communities. One of our older participants that we interviewed in Denver, Colorado, described their desire for training not as mastering advanced programs online, but gaining basic skills such as navigating email and increasing their fluency with texting. While some may deem those to be simple tasks, they represent real barriers for millions of consumers with limited exposure to technology. There was also an underlying theme of how learning digital skills can help strengthen one's self confidence, leading to greater self empowerment and ultimately greater independence and self reliance. We encourage everyone to read the report and to learn more about what else consumers discussed and the solutions that they also presented. At a high level, we urge digital inclusion organizations, industry leaders, and policymakers to use the solutions presented in the report to respond to the ongoing debate about the future of the Universal Service Fund. We believe that USF should sustain reliable, resilient networks and support a reformed Lifeline program. Lifeline reforms mean more competition, stronger program integrity, and a monthly benefit of at least $40, the figure the Atlanta father named as the line between internet and groceries. We also call on agencies like NTIA to use the data outlined in our report as they continue to deliberate on the use of BEAD non-deployment funds, which we argue should be used to address broadband adoption and broadband affordability needs as Congress originally intended. Lastly, it is imperative that this report is used by policymakers to protect the remaining $2.75 billion in Digital Equity Act funds, which can transform the lives of people across this nation by building the human infrastructure of broadband and helping them to gain access to connected devices and digital skills training. As we have said time and time again, inequity is not inevitable. We must act with purpose to make digital inclusion a reality for everyone who needs it. We must stand firm in protecting our civil rights, and we also must remain unapologetically committed to preserving our democracy. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Elisa. That gives us a great foundation for today's panel conversation. So we're joined by guests who have done extensive research about broadband and digital inclusion. And during the conversation, I'm excited to hear their insights about the blueprint, as well as key challenges and opportunities that exist to improve the experiences of those who are living on the wrong side of the digital divide. I'm going to introduce our panelists in terms of their names, titles, and organizations. But while we go around the room, I'm going to ask the panelists to tell us a bit about their work. And I'm going to pair this with some inspiration from the blueprint. So participants in focus groups in the study were asked to describe their experiences using the internet by describing them as a particular animal. So I'm going to use that question and add a bit of a spin to it and ask them what animal they would use to describe the state of broadband policy right now. So I'll begin by introducing one of the co-authors of the report, Claudia Ruiz, who is Senior Civil Rights Policy Advisor at Unidos US. Welcome, Claudia.
Hey, good morning or good afternoon. I'm on the West Coast, so good morning to those of you out here. My name is Claudia Ruiz. I'm the Senior Civil Rights Policy Advisor at Unidos US. Unidos US is the nation's largest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization. And there I manage a broad range of issues impacting civil rights and civil liberties, including voting rights, election protection, tech governance, and broadband connectivity issues. And in terms of, and I'll also just to say, I was also a co-author with Elisa, where we got to travel around the country, really hearing firsthand sort of all of these narratives and these stories and these lived experiences of exactly how folks on the wrong side of the digital divide are managing to cope in the face of ongoing pressure and mounting economic burdens. So really proud of the report that we have and really thankful to Benton and everyone and my panelists here to join us and discuss this report. And I'll just say quickly that I think the animal that comes to mind for me when thinking about the state of play, specifically with sort of digital equity and broadband policies, is a hummingbird. And I think about it, a hummingbird specifically because it's small and mighty. Its wings, right, generate a lot of power to the extent that they're almost invisible. Hummingbirds carry a lot of frenetic energy. And it also, hummingbirds tend to have to work very hard just to stay in place. And I feel like that's what the fight for digital equity really feels like right now, in the sense that there's a lot of urgency, there's a lot of energy and effort and momentum, but at the same time, it feels like the ground continues to shift beneath us.
Thanks, Claudia. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dominique Harrison. She's the founding principal of Equity Innovation Ventures. Welcome, Dominique.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. And bravo to Claudia and Dr. Elisa Valentin for producing a great report. I'm so happy to be here to chat about some of the things written in the report. I'd just like to share, I spent the last 15 years as an executive leader and expert in responsible innovation in public policy. So primarily focused on the equitable design, deployment, use, and governance of emerging technologies like AI, broadband, and issues as it relates to privacy. Currently, I'm working independent with organizations, advising them on how to build responsible, inclusive approaches to emerging technologies. And the animal that came to mind when thinking about broadband policy today was, I would say, a sloth. I actually learned today that sloths can actually swim through water 3 times faster than they can move on the ground. And I think equitable broadband policy has slowed down in the context of the environment that we live today, unfortunately, despite all of the progress that we had made in the prior years. And I think that under different conditions, like a sloth being underwater, equitable broadband policy can move much faster. So I look forward to when that day can come back again.
Thanks, Dominique. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Colin Rhinesmith. He's Associate Professor at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And it's really wonderful to be here to help celebrate this fantastic publication. As you heard, I'm an associate professor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I'm also the director of the Digital Equity Action Research Lab and author of a new book titled Digital Equity Ecosystems: How Community Coalitions Reduce Inequality and Strengthen Democracy. And I have to say that the report that we're celebrating today definitely reflects, many, many stories that I heard of coalitions doing this work across the country, digital equity coalitions, and the stories in the report, hearing the voices of individuals and their everyday experiences with technology are so important when we're talking about digital equity and broadband policy. So, and in terms of animals, right now I'm actually, I'm trying to keep this hopeful. So I'm thinking a lot about the animals that mean the most to tribal communities that hopefully will be receiving funding through NTIA's Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program. And these grants are particularly exciting because they support, or hopefully will support, broadband adoption and use, as well as broadband infrastructure. And with tribal communities being some of the least connected in the US, I'm hopeful that at least tribal broadband policy will help to address this issue.
Thanks, Colin. And finally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Bibi Reisdorf. She's a professor at the Department of Communication Studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And it's such a pleasure to be here. And I want to echo everyone else's words. The report is fantastic. I'm really honored to be part of this panel today. I've been researching digital inequalities for the last 2 decades, and a lot of what we're seeing in this report, like Colin said, has been echoed in my experiences as well, talking with people. I focused mostly on marginalized communities. So I've been working with low-income folks in urban areas. I've been working with criminal legal impacted people. And most recently, I'm also working on a project in rural Western North Carolina. And so all of those experiences are quite diverse and quite different, but they have this common thread that we're seeing in the report as well. And you'll quickly spot the German on the panel because I took a very pessimistic approach to the animal that describes broadband policy right now. I took the right now very literally. And so for me, it's a star-nosed mole. I don't know if you've seen them. If not, you should Google them. They're quite ugly and very short-sighted. And so that's kind of what we're seeing come out of the federal policymaker space for broadband policy right now. So that's why that came to mind.
Thanks, Bibi. So glad to have all of y'all here. Claudia, I wanted to start with you. So I know that in promoting the paper, you've been sharing it a lot of different venues, and you've been on Tech Policy Press podcast recently, where you described the project as one that's intentionally grounded in a democratic process, that to do the research, you left Washington, D.C. You wanted to center the voices of people who are impacted by the digital divide outside of the center of policymaking. And so could you speak to why you've described the project approach that way, and how this aligns with the historic civil rights work that UNIDOS US does.
Yeah, thank you for that, Caroline. And actually, I might start by picking up on what Dr. Reisdorf was just saying in terms of short-sightedness. And I think that one of a reason why you could aptly describe the state of digital equity policy as short-sighted is because we have a history and a legacy of not actually including impacted communities in sort of at the ground level in the design of any kind of policies or programs that actually are meant to support the universal digital inclusion. And so that's why when I say that this project was born out of or even grounded in adherence to the democratic process, I really meant that literally. Because again, like you kind of mentioned, Caroline, too often in policy work, centering community voices, it becomes something that's thought of after the fact, right? A lot of the time, policy proposals or ideas get written in sort of the White Castles on a mountain in DC, and then a listening tour, a community listening tour is bolted on the back end of it in order to quote unquote validate it. And I think Elisa and I specifically wanted to do something intentionally very different. And we wanted to start this whole process and this project by actually leaving DC. And so what we really looked to do was actually drawing people out from their living rooms, inviting them to have their talks that they would normally have at their kitchen table, to have them with us and with their neighbors and their community members at local community centers or even at community colleges. So really kind of embodying this idea of meeting people where they are and making sure that we let those insights and what they had to share and what they were living and experiencing, make sure that that was what was actually the foundation of any kind of framework. And so that's why I say that this approach isn't just one of methodology. It's not just good methodology. I think it's quite literally democracy at work. And I say that because I think the democratic process's effectiveness should be defined by whether or not people who live with the consequences of a policy actually have a real hand in shaping it. And so when Elisa and I surface insights directly from consumers who are living on the wrong side of the digital divide, we weren't really just collecting data. We weren't even just collecting anecdotes. What we were doing is actually practicing the very thing that we're ultimately advocating for at sort of a very high level, which is the idea that the people closest to harm or a negative impact because of a policy or a program should actually be the ones in closest proximity to be able to communicate that and voice that to the powers that be. And so that connects also to something else that I think that a lot of us tend to take for granted, as we tend to kind of be silos sometimes in the tech and telecom space. And that's this idea that broadband and even the internet and connectivity aren't just merely tools anymore. They're not just tools that actually help us function better. They're not even tools that help democracy function better. In many ways, they are democratic infrastructure itself, quite literally, because whether you're connected or not is increasingly really the line between access and exclusion. It's the line between opportunity and harm. So if you don't have reliable, affordable internet or a device to deploy it from, or even the skills to really make full use of the internet, you're not really just missing out on the convenience or the benefits or the nice to haves of what's online. You're missing the job posting. You're missing the telehealth appointment, the school portal, the news about your city council meeting, or even the ability to find out if there's a hearing on a policy that actually impacts you or really matters to you. And so framed that way, there's really a direct through line from connectivity to information, to civic engagement, to mobilization, and then ultimately influence and power. And so with that frame, you can see how it's easy to see what we're talking about is not just a good, it's not a luxury good, it's not a nice to have. We're talking about literal infrastructure, and we should start treating it, defending it exactly the way that we would defend our right to vote. So at UNIDOS, for us, this is a continuation, not a departure. Our civil rights work has always started from the premise that you don't get to design solutions for a community without the community in the room, right? It's like the old saying of nothing about us without us, or if you don't have a seat at the table, chances are you're probably on the menu, right? And so that's true whether we're talking about economic policy, whether we're talking about immigration policy, education, or even definitely broadband. And I think this blueprint, our report, really just makes that principle explicit in this space, in the telecom space, where too often it's really kind of treated as a technical engineering side of quirk rather than an actual issue related to civil rights and democracy writ large.
Thank you so much. For our panelists who are eager readers of this report, this work draws on the body of work of Ruha Benjamin, and particularly how we're experiencing a battle of imaginations where we've got competing visions about how we should build a shared future. So I'd like to hear from you all in your own work about, what happens when the people most impacted by broadband policy are excluded from shaping that shared policy future, and how that impacts us as a collective. Colin, I'm turning it to you first.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important issue that the report takes head on, right? And I think that what we have, one example that we can look to when we don't include people most impacted by digital inequities and social injustices are examples like digital discrimination. And, it's not surprising that digital discrimination, which became a very important issue during the last administration that the FCC took on and actually did go across the country and visited with many communities to more deeply understand the impacts of digital discrimination. Of course, that has now been attacked with a new administration. And, I think that's very unfortunate, right? And that I think the FCC's digital discrimination proceeding was exciting for many of us to see what is possible when communities are centered in broadband policy. And unfortunately, we can now see what happens on the other side of that when communities are not centered. It's a direct attack on, as Claudia was saying, democracy itself and direct, sort of democratic participation. So, I think, again, to center this report, this is another opportunity to remind policymakers in particular, but the general public about living in a representative democracy. We all must have a voice. And when we're particularly in the digital inequity conversation, we need to make sure that communities who are most harmed by harmful policies are recentered in the discussion. And we see that, and just to wrap up, I mean, the examples at the end of each case studies where we see the voices around affordability subsidies, infrastructure investment, education, and digital skills are great examples of hearing from people in their own voices and in their own words in this report that I think we can all learn from.
Thanks. Dominique, what does this bring up for you about communities that are distant from policymaking?
Yeah, what I would say is that, when the people most impacted by broadband policies are excluded from shaping them, we end up with a future imagined by a relatively small group of people whose experiences don't reflect the diversity of this country. It narrows our collective imagination about what's possible and who gets to shape and build that future. And I think that what this report highlights is that communities understand barriers that data alone can't capture. And they know whether broadband is actually affordable after hidden fees, whether digital skills training is culturally relevant, whether devices meet the needs of multi-generational households, or whether infrastructure investments are reaching the neighborhoods that have historically been overlooked. But if those lived experiences aren't reflected in policymaking, we risk investing billions of dollars for solutions that don't fully solve the problem. And that's why I think this report is so important, because it emphasizes that equitable digital participation is more about than expanding broadband. It's about expanding who has the power to define the future. And whomever imagines the solution ultimately determines what kind of future becomes accessible and possible for all.
Thank you so much. Bibi, last and not least.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you to all those amazing remarks that I fully agree with. And I would go even a step further. It's not even just that we're leaving out voices and we're potentially investing in the wrong spaces. We're also potentially making things worse. So I'm always reminded of the work that I've been doing with formerly incarcerated people who are not at any table and who have everything decided for them during incarceration, post-incarceration, during parole, during probation. And so when we see those kinds of communities with very little support, especially from the federal level right now, and not being heard, that means that especially, for this population that I've been working with, when they come out and they have been given no tools, no support to actually thrive in this digital society, and yet we kind of just expect them to figure it out, right? It's like, come back out and now you're supposed to thrive. And so that leads to issues like this revolving door effect that many people have heard of, that people keep going back to jail or prison over and over because they are not given the support and the structure and the skills and the, all the other things that we need to really thrive in the society that we're in right now. So if we are really serious about creating a more just and a more equitable community for all of us, then we need to take the people who are at the margins, who are not being heard, with us instead of leaving them behind to fend for themselves. And so, that was what was happening with the Digital Equity Act, right? We had those covered populations and we were talking to the people who are most affected by these issues. And that has been abandoned, unfortunately, by the federal government right now. And so with that, we abandoned that vision of creating this equitable access and creating these equitable communities and the community's abilities to make the most of what the internet really has to offer.
Thanks so much. Colin, you've got a new book on digital equity ecosystems recently released, and you're highlighting community coalitions as vital infrastructure for tackling digital inequality and for strengthening democracy. And you make this case that the digital divide is connected to other and deeper social divides. So how do you see this work kind of aligning with your efforts to say that the digital divide has something to do with healthy democracy?
Yeah, thank you so much. And, so I think that what's exciting about looking at the work of digital equity coalitions is the ways in which they address digital inequality through democratic participation in small group governance. So I talk about in the book community coalitions as civil society actors in the way that the United Nations has talked about coalitions and their potential for building strong democracy. But at the same time, I also draw upon work in the field of public health that has done a lot of work studying and understanding community coalitions and predicting the stages of coalition development through community coalition action theory, which is a key theory that I use in the book. And in this way, the researchers who have done a lot of work in this area have identified a number of key sort of characteristics of the ways in which coalitions and digital equity coalitions, in the case of the book that I have just written, the ways in which community coalitions enable a healthy democracy. And so these include things like civic participation, tolerance, accountability, transparency, deliberation, in controlling abuses of power. And we see that in coalition work that is cross-sector, and you see people and organizations from very different parts of a community. And of course, this matters the sort of the size of the community. But the coalitions that I studied in the book were primarily located in larger urban areas. We see that this diversity actually being an incredible strength of coalitions in their ability to bring diverse constituents together across different sectors to practice democracy in action. And so, so I argue that, healthy digital equity ecosystems not only rely on the energy of coalitions, or what I refer to as sort of the people power, or as the champions that we know in the digital equity space of doing this work, but also, again, the diversity of coalition members that bring their unique assets to digital equity work. And so ultimately, when these community coalitions are at their best, what I talk about and the examples I provide in the book really do show what's possible at the local level to promote a healthy democratic society more broadly. And so, really, it's also what is so important about the Blueprint report is, I think coupling together, allowing communities to be a part of these coalitions, meaning individual community members alongside organizations, that's really where the movement building begins, and the sort of community capacity building, it offers a lot of potential. So
Thank you so much. I want to talk a bit about the role of policymakers here. So this is for Dominique and for Bibi. Are there parts of this report that resonate with you in terms of what you think policymakers can learn? How do you want policymakers essentially to learn from these findings? And I'm also thinking about across both of your sort of bodies of research and work about low-income communities, communities of color, rural communities, things that really stand out for you. Bibi, go for it.
Yeah, there were three things that really stood out to me, and I'm going to try to be brief. The first one was the continued issue of cost, which I'll get into in a minute. The second one, the ubiquity of wanting to improve skills, especially related to internet safety. And the third one was building on the expertise of communities. So for the cost one, this is something Colin and I have been working on for a long time. And there's this continued myth that keeps coming up over and over again, that people who don't subscribe to home internet just don't need it, or they're not interested, or whatever else we can come up with. And that comes up every few years. And I think what the report shows really impressively, and also what ACP really impressively showed, is that if you have a well-designed and thought out subsidy program that allows families and individuals to have that permanent, stable home internet connection that they don't have to weigh for over like paying the bills or paying the rent, because it is like a utility, right? So if you have that, it really changes the narrative for people. And so I think this is a really low-hanging fruit for policymakers to, reinstate something like the ACP, especially when we're thinking about the universal service funds redesign or reimagining. And it would really level the playing field for people to be able to access the internet safely and comfortably from their own home as well. In terms of skills, it really stood out to me that this is not an issue that affects just one group of people. It was really interesting to me to see that, regardless of educational background, people wanted to learn more on how to keep themselves safe. And it's with all the evolving things, AI and all the new technologies coming all the time, there are new opportunities and there are new risks, and they're for everyone, right? The risks don't just like fall on a specific group of people. They can be higher for a certain group of people, but I think it's really those two top priorities, the AI skills and the safety skills, that are really important for policymakers to focus on, because the risks can be really high, the stakes can be high, especially again, if I think of returning citizens coming back out who are desperate often to find a job or to find stable housing, and they are preyed on for those kinds of things with internet scams. So again, those safety skills are really, really important. And then the third one, I couldn't agree more, centering the communities in how you make policies, how you set policies, because they know best. They know what their specific communities need. I've been working over the last year and a half in rural Western North Carolina, and that area has been ravaged by Hurricane Helene almost 2 years ago now. And these communities are very tight-knit, and they're also very resourceful. That doesn't mean they don't need some assistance in terms of financial support to rebuild lost infrastructure, but they are the ones who know best what should happen, where it should happen, how it should be implemented. So I think policymakers really need to understand that they don't need to come in and micromanage everything, whether that be on the federal level or the state level, but that they should really trust their communities, that they know best what is needs to be done and how we should best do it.
Yeah, so there are two things I'd say. One is that one of the sections that truly resonated with me was the section on how structural barriers shape digital participation. And a quote that I grabbed from the report was by Tressie McMillan Cottom. And that person says that nothing about the future of this country can be resolved unless it is first resolved in the South. And I thought that point was so right on, and one that highlights an essential theme that I've written about in a report I worked on while at the Joint Center called Expanding Broadband in the Black Rural South. I think it's important to focus on the South because the South tells us the truth about the challenges we're trying to solve. The region sits at the intersection of the many inequities that broadband policy is intended to address. It has some of the highest concentrations of persistent poverty, the largest share of Black communities in the country, significant rural populations, tribal communities, and regions that have experienced decades of underinvestment in critical infrastructures. And those realities make the South a place where digital inequities are often more visible. But they're certainly not unique to the South, and that certainly doesn't mean those regions are more important than others, right? Another thing that I would like to add is that one of the most important lessons that I learned during my time in federal government is the passing of the legislation is only the beginning. Congress establishes the vision and authorizes the funding, but it's the implementing agencies that determine how those programs are carried out. Federal agencies do have some discretion in developing program guidance and administrative rules, but they must operate within the boundaries of the legislation. And that's where design really matters. Too often, these communities' wisdom, as the report shares, is often left out. And these programs are designed by people who may have deep expertise in policy or in administration, but limited understanding of the lived realities of the communities they're trying to serve. And that's why agencies frequently rely on large consulting firms to help operationalize programs. And while these partners bring technical expertise, they don't always bring the deep community knowledge. And the result is that seemingly small policy decisions can have enormous consequences for whether a program actually solves the problem that it was created to address. So I'll give you an example. As the former director of the Office of Minority Broadband Initiatives at NTIA, I oversaw the Connecting Minority Communities pilot program, which invested in HBCUs, tribal colleges and universities, and other minority-serving institutions to strengthen their broadband infrastructure, increase cybersecurity capacity, but also to develop workforce development opportunities. As institutions began implementing their projects, I learned something that may not have been fully visible during the program's design. Many campuses had broadband infrastructure that was decades old. And before they could deploy new Wi-Fi with the funding that was given or improve their connectivity, they first needed to rewire portions of their network, which also meant digging and providing construction on campuses. However, one of the program's rules prohibited grant funds from being used for construction activities, including the infrastructure work necessary to modernize those networks. And as a result, some institutions had to scale back their ambitions and use funds primarily for maintenance rather than transformational upgrades for their campuses that they actually need. And that example really resonated with me when I read this report, because one of its findings is that equity-centered infrastructure deployment, maintenance, and upgrades are essential to ensure that low-income communities consistently experience quality broadband service. And to me, that's exactly the lesson. If we want policy to produce equitable outcomes, equity can't simply be an aspiration or a guiding principle. It has to be embedded in the program's design, eligibility requirements, funding rules, and implementation guidance. Otherwise, even well-intentioned investments can fall short because the parameters of the program don't reflect the realities on the ground or the community's wisdom. And that's why people closest to the problem have to be involved from the beginning. They don't just help identify the need, they help define the conditions required for a solution to actually work.
Thanks so much. Claudia, the panelists have highlighted here that affordability and skills are really important focuses of the report. And I want to talk about some recent arguments of your organization, others in the public interest community, about ways in which fraud, waste, and abuse, this phrase, keeps becoming weaponized against federal programs that are designed to serve low-income people. What are the implications for broadband policies? And Elisa, many minutes ago, mentioned universal service reform. So in that context too, how is this fraud, waste, and abuse narrative coming up, and how are you countering it?
Yeah, I think unfortunately we don't have to look very far to see how these false narratives and justifications are already being weaponized to cause serious damage and serious harm. So, to begin with, FCC Chairman Carr has already been using this narrative as a rationale for a top-bottom review of E-Rate, right? A program that has connected schools and libraries for over 30 years. with the FCC even now kind of, right, because of that foundation of waste, fraud, and abuse, right? Now the FCC is asking the public whether the program should even continue at all, right? And whether it should continue to exist. Meanwhile, over at NTIA, right, the same frame and the same false claims have been used to justify withholding BEAD non-deployment funds, right, that states are otherwise statutorily owed. It's also being used to rewrite a lot of the programmatic rules well outside of what Congress authorized, right, in the bipartisan infrastructure law that authorized those programs. And finally, it was also the justification to be used to unilaterally and unlawfully cancel the Digital Equity Act altogether. Now, these are all kind of bits and pieces that are happening across the sort of telecom space, but we know that this justification is also sort of a linchpin in the ongoing playbook that this current administration is using to justify extreme executive overreach, right, across agencies and even toward weaponizing it against the states. So, for example, it's the same frame that's being used to justify expansion of the Treasury Department's do not pay system, where now this administration is trying to fold in things like Social Security databases into that system in order to sort of further consolidate control, right, over these kinds of systems. This administration is also standing up task forces whose stated mission is fraud prevention, right? But what they're actually doing is roping in language around immigration status, benefits access, and now even voting and voter eligibility, right? And tying that back to databases like DHS's SAVE database, which is actually the subject of an ongoing litigation and a really great opinion that just came out this week. And so in every one of these cases, right, whether it's E-rate, whether it's BEAD, whether it's Digital Equity Act, whether it's the do not pay system, the pattern here is really the same, right? First, you start with fraud. You just name fraud first, right, without even ever having to demonstrate it, right? And then that burden of proof, right, of having to prove that there is no fraud, right, having to prove a negative, quietly shifts onto the programs and the very people who rely on it, right? And instead of that burden of proof having to stay actually on the people claiming it, it's actually being shifted over to the folks that are already struggling day to day to keep up with sort of daily life, daily expenses, and even sort of trying to even protect and exercise their own rights. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't state, right, that none of this is happening because there actually is any evidence of widespread fraud. It's happening because fraud is a label that allows any administration in power to build infrastructure its own way, right? Decide who gets to be a part of that infrastructure, who has a say in it, and then ultimately through that process also consolidate authority and concentrate power without having to ask Congress, without having to go through APA rulemaking, and even being able to do all of that in the face of any checks and balances that are supposed to ensure oversight and accountability. And so that's why, right, sort of my earlier remarks around democracy and this whole exercise being sort of an exercise of the democratic process itself, I think really rings true in this moment, right, more than ever. And I think that's part of the reason why advocates across every sector need to be watching the actions of this administration extremely closely, because we're not just talking about technical governance questions or trying to figure out how to make programs more effective. What we're doing is really kind of battling for the actual separation of powers that our democracy relies upon. And the reality is that this is also not neutral, right, and who it is affecting first and foremost. These kinds of moves, these kind of power grabs, they consistently land hardest on the same communities. Low-income households, communities of color, immigrant communities, rural communities, right? The very same people that are blueprint centers and who we interviewed and engaged with in order to develop this framework. Now, against all this entire backdrop, right, USF reform, conversations around USF reform are happening in exactly this climate. So if we permit sort of this false claim of waste, fraud, and abuse to sort of set the terms of any conversation we have around USF reform, right? If the same way in which we've let it kind of poison discussions around E-rate and BEAD, or even the ways that it's been able to be weaponized and poison and erode our voting rights, expand surveillance of our communities, even being used to justify the targeting of political opponents, right? We're not going to be able to have a good conversation about how to reimagine a universal service fund that actually works, right, in the way that we need it to. So we need to start, rather, if we actually allow sort of this false frame of waste, fraud, and abuse to sort of be our starting point for these conversations, right, what we're going to get is justifications for gutting it and for concentrating decision-making about who actually gets connected into fewer, less accountable hands. And so that's why, again, I really think that this blueprint approach matters right now, right? We started this process back in 2024 in what many would say is a very different world. And I think as true as it was then, it's even truer in this moment, right? And in many ways, this approach and the paper itself is a renewed commitment to defending our communities, to defending American democracy, and even defending sort of the rights and liberties of our communities, and even the communities that each of us live in. And so I think it's also worth naming sort of just, quickly that control over broadband and communications infrastructure is also sort of a key feature of and a core cause and effect of actually this playbook. It's a core piece, right? It's a core piece of making sure that whoever controls the channel is ultimately who also gets to control and decide who gets to be heard. And so insisting that policies get built for and by the very people that it affects through channels that are transparent, that are inclusive, that are accountable, right? That sort of process and a commitment to that sort of structure or that vision is a rejection of any kind of anti-democratic playbook. And it really is a double down on protecting the individual rights and freedoms of people living in this country.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask you all a final question before I look to see if we've got questions from our audience on YouTube. How does the blueprint leave you feeling right now about this moment and our work in addressing the digital divide? Do you feel hopeful? Do you feel concerned? Do you feel a mix of both? Are you feeling like are you with the very short-sighted animal, BB, the very particular type of mole you mentioned? I'm going to start with you.
Against all odds, I'm actually feeling hopeful. So the report really highlighted a lot of those really important issues. And the beauty of it is that, and Colin can speak to this better than I do, but I have some experience with coalitions and I'm involved in some coalition work. And we know the people who are doing this work, and they are great people and they're really invested in this issue. And we've been here before. We've been at this place where there is no funding, right? No federal funding, and people kind of have to figure it out. And I also want to, my last words, I'm stealing from Angela Siefer, the executive director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, who at the last Net Inclusion said, resist, dream, do. And that's exactly what communities are doing and what coalitions are doing. And so I am feeling hopeful that we won't get out of this unscathed, but we will work our way out of this somehow.
Dominique, how are you feeling?
Yeah, I'm feeling the same way. I'm feeling hopeful. And I think that despite the setbacks to derail the progress, the investments, the programs that support digital equity, that this moment will not last long. I think what we've seen in the report is that we've got the data, we've got the information, and we also have the advocacy and the coalitions, as BB and Colin have spoken about. And now what I think is that we write the prescription, we write the playbook for what needs to happen in 2028. And I look forward to that time where I think and I feel as though we'll really get back to where we need to be in order to solve the challenge of closing the digital divide, based upon the great work that has been done in the prior years.
Colin, how are you feeling?
So I'm still feeling hopeful. And I'm hopeful because this blueprint exists, right? And just to echo what others have said, I mean, broadband policy or not, like I think a lot of us who are in this work are doing this because we have an opportunity to work with communities alongside them to, improve local situations. And I think that the blueprint, one thing I'm excited about in terms of the recommendations is that, the blueprint suggests that multiple stakeholders must work together, right, to address the digital divide. And, I agree that community coalitions are the way to start larger, broader social movements for change. And I think that if we look at it in this way, and we look at the report and the blueprint in this way, it leaves us a lot to be hopeful with at a time of great concern.
Claudia, you get the last word on the feeling or the mood of this moment.
I guess I have to say that I'm proud. I'm very proud, first of all, to be able to have completed and published the report. But I'm even more proud that the sort of thought leaders that we have here, that really kind of committed academics who really understand these issues in ways that I only can hope that I can. I'm really proud of the fact that it resonates with you all first and foremost, and I'm really grateful for your guys' not only reading it, it is kind of long, but also for being willing to discuss it here and today. But what I would say is I'm also proud because of what the time and what I saw and the energy and the insights and the wisdom that I saw in each and every one of the rooms where we hosted those focus groups was something that made me very proud to be a part of this community, to be to be an American, and to really kind of see sort of the ways in which individuals really come to life when you give them an opportunity to demonstrate agency and to sort of demonstrate self-direction. And so I think pride is just really kind of overall what I'm feeling right now. I think especially as we head into sort of a midterm election year for sure.
Thank you so much. I am looking to see if YouTube watchers are submitting comments. We've got some positive feedback about the approach for certain. I'm thrilled to see. We'll be left to my improvised questions if we don't hear from YouTube commenters. So I'm going to, oh, here we go. All right, somebody has saved you from mine. We have this question about instances of localized subsidy programs, so affordability, and this question mentions service, so I'm thinking about broadband service, but feel free to bring devices into the mix here too, where coalitions have been involved. Any sparks, examples?
I want to ask Bibi this question because you've done more recent research than I have on my, but I'm happy to share what I found during my book as well.
There are conversations on it. I think the tricky part is, where does the money come from, right? So we are unfortunately in a place right now where money is tight for everyone. So it's not just digital equity programs or digital opportunity programs. It's everything, right? Everything's strapped for money. And so I know there are policy proposals out there, certainly here in North Carolina. Whether there is actual money to make this happen is a different question, but there are certainly there's a push towards those kinds of programs. Yeah.
I just wanted to add that one of the great things about the CMC program is that it allowed the communities to design the programs in which were important for their institutions, but also the surrounding areas. And one benefit of that was that those institutions worked with a number of community partners to develop these kind of larger coalitions to address, whatever issues were important to those institutions. But they were also able to give out subsidies to specific impacted communities in order to pay for broadband services for a year or two. That came from large telecom companies in terms of providing this service, but they were also able to negotiate specific kinds of rates. And so to that question, I think it's very important that you have a number of different kind of actors. Now, the funding came from a federal program, but there are other opportunities where you can bring those different types of organizations to find resources to help support that kind of work.
Thanks so much. We got a question about practicing these sorts of skills and tactics of being very close to the community when it comes to discovering policy problems, describing policy problems, and also thinking of solutions. Comment about this at the state level, the level that a lot of us have seen policy work turn towards because we perceive there might be more possibilities there right now.
Well, one thing I can jump in on quickly is one of the things that I learned about in the research for my book is that some state broadband and digital equity offices actually turned to local coalitions that were exemplars in their regions because of the trust that they had built in working with local community members in terms of the effectiveness of their organizing and community capacity building that I talk about in my book. That actually states said, we need your help, right? And we need your help if we're going to implement statewide policies. And so what I saw in a couple of states and a couple of examples is this, essentially that coalition served as the interface between individual community members and state broadband offices. And again, that's the power of the coalitions. And I think that's probably one example that first comes to my mind.
Yeah, I think that's like, yeah, Colin calling that out, I actually think is an excellent example of another reason why the Digital Equity Act and sort of the bipartisan, the suite of digital equity kind of programs that was authorized by the infrastructure law was really sort of innovative and really powerful, is because it mandated that kind of community assessment, community mapping, community engagement, and even building a sort of permanent community feedback loop that I think actually in many ways we're still seeing happening today, right? The programs may be gone, but those state broadband offices are very much still there. And so they're still very much, ready to work with communities, ready to engage with communities. And that's still a lot of the work that we're even doing sort of at the state and local level. I might say that, something else from an Unidos US perspective that we call for is specifically when it comes to sort of novel governance models for emerging technologies, including like AI, is making sure that as much as we're innovating, right, in terms of the tools and the technologies we have, we should also be innovating in the ways that we can build novel democratic mechanisms to ensure that permanent feedback, right? Because it shouldn't be that Elisa and I have to go in and right across the country and interview people ourselves. It shouldn't have to be that Colin or Bibi, right, or Dominique have to do this right through their own academic research. This should actually be built into the sort of function of state and local governments already. And so if that's something that you don't think is happening in your neighborhood, in your community, at your state, go, send an email, make a call, right? Like nothing will change unless you start it to. And I think you would be very surprised that a lot of the time state and local government bodies are very responsive to outreach, because a lot of the time they're not always getting it. Like I think it was Colin or Caroline, how you mentioned right now, states are getting a little bit busier because a lot more is happening at the state level. But I still think, what they're definitely hungry for and eager for is that sort of community outreach. And they're generally tend to be all ears and really welcome it.
Could I add that you can search on ntia.gov for more information about your state broadband office? They have the contact email for those folks working there. So make sure to reach out.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I love closing this up with a call to action too. Thank you for getting us into that space. Again, I want to thank all of the organizations that helped put this research together. I want to thank our panelists for being here to comment on it. This was truly a pleasure to get to talk and think with you all. And we could probably talk about this for a whole nother hour, but at this point, we will wrap up. I encourage folks again to go read the report and to have an excellent afternoon. Thanks, everybody.